What if I told you that the Nazi Party didn't begin with Hitler's speeches or Mein Kampf or the beer hall putsch? It began in the winter of 1918 in the blood-soaked streets of Berlin, when 400,000 battle-hardened soldiers came home from the trenches of World War I to find their country in chaos, and decided that democracy was the enemy. They called themselves the Freikorps, the Free Corps, volunteer militias of former German soldiers who refused to surrender their weapons, refused to accept Germany's defeat, and refused to let the new democratic government survive. They were men who had learned to kill efficiently in the industrial slaughter of the Western Front, and they brought those skills home. For 5 years, from 1918 to 1923, these paramilitary death squads fought a secret civil war in Germany's streets. They assassinated elected officials, they crushed workers' uprisings, they murdered over 1,000 political opponents. And when their work was done, when German democracy lay broken and bleeding, they melted into a new organization that promised to finish what they'd started. That organization was called the Nazi Party. This is the story of how veterans of one war created the conditions for an even more catastrophic one. How violence became a political strategy, and how the men who claimed to love Germany destroyed it. This is the story of the Freikorps. November 11th, 1918. The armistice that ended World War I was supposed to bring peace to Germany. Instead, it brought chaos. The Kaiser abdicated. The monarchy collapsed. A provisional democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was hastily proclaimed. And millions of soldiers began streaming home from the front lines, many still carrying their weapons. These men were traumatized, brutalized, and utterly unprepared for what they found. While they'd been fighting and dying in the trenches, the home front had collapsed. Food shortages, inflation. Communist revolutionaries seizing control of major cities. Workers' and soldiers' councils declaring Soviet-style republics. The old social order, everything they thought they'd been fighting for, was disintegrating. And here's the psychological trap that would shape everything that followed. These soldiers had been indoctrinated for 4 years with the belief that they were heroic defenders of the fatherland. They'd endured unimaginable horror in the trenches because they believed their sacrifice was noble, necessary, meaningful. Then they came home to be told that Germany had lost, that their sacrifices were pointless, that the war had been unjust from the beginning, that they should disarm, demobilize, and accept a humiliating peace treaty. For hundreds of thousands of these men, this was psychologically impossible. They couldn't accept that 4 years of trauma meant nothing. So they constructed an alternative narrative. Germany hadn't lost militarily, it had been stabbed in the back. Betrayed by communists, socialists, and Jews on the home front. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth. This lie would reshape the 20th century, and the men who believed it most fanatically formed the Freikorps. The first Freikorps units were actually formed by the provisional government itself, a decision that would prove catastrophically short-sighted. In December 1918, Berlin was on the brink of communist revolution. The Spartacist League, German communists inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, was organizing armed uprisings. The government had no reliable military force. The regular army was dissolving, police were overwhelmed. So the social democratic leaders of the new republic made a deal with the devil. They authorized former military officers to form volunteer units to restore order. These became the Freikorps. But here's what made the Freikorps different from a regular army. They weren't fighting for a government or a constitution. They were fighting for a vision of Germany that the government itself represented a betrayal of. They accepted government pay and weapons while despising everything the government stood for. The Spartacist Uprising, January 1919. The Spartacist League launched an armed insurrection in Berlin. Communist fighters seized newspaper offices, train stations, and government buildings. For a moment, it looked like Germany might follow Russia into Bolshevik revolution. The Freikorps response was swift and merciless. Units like the Gardkavallerie Schützen Division, under Captain Waldemar Pabst, swept through Berlin with methodical brutality. They didn't just suppress the uprising, they hunted down its leaders. On January 15, 1919, they captured Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the intellectual leaders of German communism. Both were murdered that night. Liebknecht was shot while trying to escape. The classic extrajudicial execution cover story. Luxemburg was beaten with rifle butts, shot in the head, and her corpse thrown into a canal. Her body wasn't found for months. These weren't heat-of-battle killings. They were calculated political assassinations carried out by men in German military uniforms with the tacit approval of the democratic government. And the Freikorps had just learned that political murder worked. The proliferation of violence. By mid-1919, there were over 400,000 men in various Freikorps units across Germany. They had romantic militant names: Eiserne Division, Iron Division, Marine Brigade Erhard, Bund Oberland, Oberland League. Each unit operated semi-independently, loyal to its commander rather than any government. They developed their own insignia, many featuring the swastika, which was already circulating in far-right circles as a symbol of Aryan identity. They sang their own songs, wrote their own codes of honor, created their own mythology. They were proto-fascist warrior cults, and they were armed and operating openly in German cities. The pattern repeated across Germany. Communist or socialist uprisings would break out, the government would call in Freikorps units to crush them, and the Freikorps would respond with overwhelming brutality. In Munich, Bremen, the Ruhr Valley, wherever the left organized, the Freikorps struck. But here's what's crucial to understand. The violence always exceeded what was necessary to restore order. Prisoners were executed. Civilians were shot on suspicion of being sympathizers. Bodies were left in the streets as warnings. This wasn't crowd control. This was terror as a political tool, and it was radicalizing German politics in a very specific direction. The left was being physically eliminated, while the far right was being trained, armed, and normalized. By 1920, the Freikorps had shifted from fighting communists to fighting democracy itself. The Kapp Putsch, March 13, 1920. The Marine Brigade Erhard, 5,000 Freikorps troops wearing swastika helmets, marched on Berlin and seized the government quarter. Their leader, Wolfgang Kapp, declared himself chancellor. The legitimate government fled to Stuttgart. For 4 days, Germany had two governments, the elected democratic one in exile and the Freikorps-backed military dictatorship in Berlin. The coup ultimately failed, not because of military resistance, but because workers across Germany launched a general strike that paralyzed the economy. The Freikorps retreated. But here's what's terrifying. Almost none of the coup participants were punished. Most Freikorps officers returned to their units. Many would later join the Nazi Party. The lesson the Freikorps learned wasn't "don't attempt coups," it was "next time, plan better." Organization Consul. After the Kapp Putsch failed, the more extreme Freikorps units went underground. The most notorious was Organization Consul, OC, led by Captain Hermann Ehrhardt. OC was essentially a right-wing terrorist organization. They compiled lists of November criminals, politicians they blamed for accepting the armistice and signing the Treaty of Versailles. Then they systematically assassinated them. Between 1919 and 1922, OC and similar groups murdered. Matthias Erzberger, former finance minister, signed the armistice. Shot 12 times while hiking. Philipp Scheidemann, former chancellor, survived an assassination attempt with prussic acid. Walter Rathenau, foreign minister, Jewish, machine-gunned in his open-top car. But those are just the high-profile victims. Historians estimate over 350 political assassinations were carried out by right-wing paramilitaries during the Weimar period. Left-wing assassinations? 22. The asymmetry is staggering, and it reveals something crucial about the nature of German democracy in this period. It was being murdered in broad daylight, and the institutions that should have defended it were either unable or unwilling to stop it. The judicial catastrophe. Here's why the assassinations continued. The German judicial system was still staffed by judges from the Kaiser's era. Conservative, nationalist, sympathetic to the Freikorps' goals even if not their methods. When left-wing political violence was prosecuted, the sentences were harsh. When right-wing violence was prosecuted, and often it wasn't, the sentences were minimal or suspended. Rothenau's assassins were initially celebrated by right-wing students. When some were eventually convicted, they received sentences measured in months, not years. Many were released early. Some were never caught. The message was clear. If you were killing for the right cause, the system would protect you. By 1923, official Freikorps units were being disbanded under pressure from the Allied powers. But the men, the networks, the ideology, and the expertise in political violence didn't disappear. They migrated into the Nazi Party. The human pipeline. Look at the Nazi Party leadership, and you're looking at a Freikorps reunion. Ernst Röhm, Freikorps commander, became leader of the SA Sturmabteilung, the Nazi paramilitary force. The SA was essentially the Freikorps rebranded, using the same tactics, recruiting the same men. Hermann Göring, Freikorps member, became Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe. Rudolf Höss, Freikorps member, later became commandant of Auschwitz. Heinrich Himmler participated in Freikorps activities as a young man, later headed the SS and orchestrated the Holocaust. The Freikorps weren't just a recruiting ground for Nazis, they were a training academy. These men learned crowd intimidation, street fighting, political assassination, and the psychological techniques of paramilitarism, years before they applied those skills to building the Third Reich. The Beer Hall Putsch, November 8th to 9th, 1923. Hitler and the Nazi Party attempted their own version of the Kapp Putsch in Munich. The plan was classic Freikorps: armed seizure of government buildings, declaration of a national revolution, march on Berlin. It failed even more spectacularly than Kapp's attempt. Police opened fire on the Nazi marchers. 16 Nazis died. Hitler was arrested. But here's what's crucial. The Nazis learned the same lesson the Freikorps had learned. Force alone wasn't enough. You needed to corrupt the system from within. You needed to make violence legal. Hitler spent 9 months in prison writing Mein Kampf. When he emerged, he committed to a new strategy. The Nazi Party would gain power through elections while using paramilitary violence to intimidate opponents. Legal revolution backed by illegal terror. It was the Freikorps method refined to perfection. The SA Freikorps reborn. By the late 1920s, the SA had grown to hundreds of thousands of men. They wore uniforms, marched in formation, fought communists in the streets, protected Nazi rallies, and disrupted opposition meetings. Sound familiar? They were the Freikorps by another name, but now officially part of a political party that was gaining electoral legitimacy. The Weimar Republic faced the same impossible situation it had faced in 1918. It needed someone to maintain order, but the only organizations capable of providing that order wanted to destroy the Republic itself. By 1933, when Hitler became chancellor, he didn't need a coup. The Freikorps had spent 15 years preparing the ground. They'd normalized political violence. They'd eliminated hundreds of democratic leaders. They'd created a culture where armed paramilitaries were an accepted part of politics. They'd trained an entire generation in the aesthetics and tactics of fascism. Hitler didn't overthrow German democracy. The Freikorps had already murdered it. Hitler just made it official. The story of the Freikorps forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Can democracy survive determined organized violence? The Weimar Republic had everything we're told a democracy needs: a constitution, free elections, rule of law, freedom of speech and assembly. But it was destroyed anyway, not by a foreign invasion, but by armed men who refused to accept that violence had limits in a civilized society. The paradox of democratic tolerance. The Weimar government faced an impossible dilemma. To suppress the Freikorps would require an armed force. But the only armed forces available were either Freikorps themselves or the remnants of an army that sympathized with them. Moreover, aggressive suppression of right-wing paramilitaries would have been painted as confirmation of the Jewish Bolshevik government narrative. The Freikorps would have become martyrs. Their cause would have gained sympathy, but tolerating them allowed them to systematically eliminate democracy's defenders, to create a culture where political violence was normalized, to train the cadres who would later staff the Nazi apparatus. This is the paradox philosopher Karl Popper would later call the paradox of tolerance. A society that tolerates those who wish to destroy tolerance will eventually see tolerance destroyed. Weimar tried tolerance. It failed. The psychology of the veteran. We need to understand the psychological state of the Freikorps members, not to excuse them, but to recognize the pattern. These men experienced the most intense trauma imaginable: industrial warfare on the Western Front. They watched friends die in arbitrary, meaningless ways. They survived horrors that shattered their understanding of civilization. Then they came home to a society that didn't honor their sacrifice, that wanted them to just move on, become civilians, accept that it was all for nothing. For many, this was psychologically impossible. They needed their suffering to mean something, and fascism gave them that meaning. It told them they were heroes betrayed, warriors whose true battle was just beginning, saviors who would redeem Germany. Violence became their purpose. The Freikorps became their tribe, and anything that threatened that new identity, democracy, peace, compromise, became the enemy. We see this pattern repeat throughout history. Traumatized veterans returning to societies that can't or won't help them process their trauma, turning instead to extremist movements that promise purpose and belonging. The institutional failure. But the deeper failure was institutional. The German judiciary, military leadership, and civil service were never truly loyal to the Weimar Republic. They were holdovers from the Kaiser's Germany, men who viewed democracy as a temporary embarrassment to be endured. When Freikorps members assassinated elected officials, judges gave them light sentences because, deep down, many judges agreed with the murders. When Freikorps units attempted coups, military officers looked the other way because they sympathized with the goals. This is the real lesson. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires institutions staffed by people genuinely committed to democratic values. Without that commitment, the forms of democracy, elections, parliaments, courts, become theater masking the actual power dynamics. The Freikorps succeeded because Germany's institutions secretly wanted them to succeed. The Freikorps story is a warning about what happens when a society tries to use violence to solve a political crisis. The Weimar government authorized the Freikorps to fight communists, believing they could control and then disband these units when the crisis passed. Instead, they created a monster that devoured them. Violence is not a tool you can pick up and put down. It's a virus. Once you introduce it into the political system, it metastasizes. The men trained to use violence become addicted to it. The institutions that authorize violence become dependent on it. The society that tolerates violence becomes desensitized to it. By 1933, Germans had watched 15 years of political violence. They'd seen assassinations, street battles, attempted coups, and paramilitary intimidation become normal parts of political life. When the Nazis came to power and began systematically eliminating their opponents, it didn't seem like a radical break. It seemed like an escalation of what had already been happening. The Freikorps normalized what should have been unthinkable. And here's what should terrify us. We're watching this pattern begin again in democracies around the world. Armed groups claiming to protect society from perceived threats. Political violence being excused or minimized when it comes from our side. Veterans being radicalized by extremist movements that promise purpose. Institutions failing to equally enforce laws against political violence. The specifics are different. The pattern is identical. The Freikorps existed for only 5 years, from 1918 to 1923. But their legacy lasted decades. They murdered the people who might have saved German democracy. They trained the men who would build the Nazi state. They normalized the use of violence as a political tool. They created the cultural conditions where fascism could flourish. When we study the Holocaust, when we try to understand how an advanced society committed industrialized genocide, we often focus on 1933 to 1945. But the real story begins 15 years earlier in the streets of post-war Germany, with men who decided that their trauma, their hatred, and their violence were more important than democracy. The Freikorps proves that democracies don't usually die from external invasion. They die from internal rot, from institutions that refuse to defend themselves, from societies that tolerate intolerance, from men with guns who decide that political disagreement justifies murder, and they die slowly. One assassination at a time, one normalized atrocity at a time, one compromised institution at a time, until the day someone like Hitler walks into the hollowed-out shell of democracy and declares it dead. The Freikorps were soldiers who never stopped fighting, but they weren't fighting for Germany. They were fighting against the very idea that violence has limits in a civilized society. They won that fight, and 60 million people died as a result. Today, in democracies around the world, we're seeing the warning signs: political polarization, institutional decay, the normalization of political violence, the romanticization of armed paramilitary groups, the refusal to equally prosecute violence based on ideology. The lesson of the Freikorps isn't that this can't happen again. It's that it's always trying to happen. Democracy is always one crisis away from collapsing into the arms of men who promise order through violence. The question is whether we'll learn from Weimar's failure or repeat it. If you want to understand how fascism actually comes to power, how violence corrupts democracy, and how we might prevent history from repeating itself, subscribe. Because these aren't just history lessons, they're warnings. The Freikorps believed they were saving Germany. Instead, they built the road to Auschwitz. Let's make sure we're not building that road again.